today I have the immense privilege to have with me Tyshawn Sorey, uh, composer, multi-instrumentalist, educator, um, and personally for me, someone I admire immensely. And this is the first time we've actually had a conversation um, at any length. We were trying to get together, I think it was about 2 years ago, Tyshawn, in
Yeah, at
New
least
Haven.
something like that, like 2 years ago. Yeah, and then a
And,
year ago in
I,
New York.
and I can't, that was my bad, but anyhow,
No,
I
no
had something
worries.
else going on. But, one of the things that I have a love-hate relationship with Instagram, but one of the things I think is valuable about social media is the fact that you can connect with people that with maybe have common interests or that you're just interested in on a direct level. And so Tyshawn and I have been uh, we've been sort of going back and forth in the DMs through Instagram. And one of the things that I have to say about your work, Tyshawn, that has just really fascinated me is how you seem not to fit, or you don't want to fit in any mold as a black artist.
Uh,
And as you know, it's very common for people in our day and age to want to do that somehow. And as an African American growing up in Columbus, Ohio, and
mm,
having sort of a very unique experience with culture and music, I just find it so inspiring to see someone like yourself uh, break down any sort of barriers as it relates to genre or how people think things should be, and you just address them on your own terms. So with that said, I mean, I just wanted to get an idea from you. I mean, especially with everything that's going on with the climate, with the sort of racial injustice and the awareness of racial injustice, and many people trying to reconcile with all of that. I mean, you're in your own experiences as a composer. How has this journey been as far as your work being accepted? Is it classified as contemporary music, contemporary classical music, jazz? You shared a story recently, I know,
mm,
online about uh, uh, sharing your work in an audition for an institution for a school, and the staff or the faculty uh,
uh,
saying outright that they weren't expecting someone like yourself to have submitted what you submitted. And I thought that was a perfect like microcosm of what happens today and how black composers are viewed and black artists and musicians. So I just wanted to kind of get your take on that just initially, and then we can sort of
mm.
unpack it from there.
I guess going back to the early part of your statement, you talk about I I guess my the submission of my application to several institutions or whatever, one of which I won't name, but the one that we're talking about did indeed say that they weren't necessarily expecting a quote unquote legit composer. Now, personally, I didn't know what that meant, you know, just in
Right?
terms of the way that the word legit, was applied there, in that conversation, basically saying that, we weren't really expecting, an African American composer to sort of, you know, be so inspired by European and American modernism to the point where the work on paper looks very legit or something like that. Like I don't think they were expecting quote unquote more jazz or things that quote unquote belonged to me, if you will. In other words, like I didn't stay in my lane enough for them. But anyway, to revisit that conversation it just, you know, it's amazing how timeless such incidents are and how they really, you know, they really, that particular incident really inspired me to really get, you know, a different kind of relationship to my work than what I had, you know, back then was which was this sort of quote unquote utopia vision or whatever of, you know, being able to have this omnivorous appetite for all kinds of music, you know, coming from different kinds of traditions and cultures and things like that. You know, I was always interested in creativity, and so for me, I would explore things. You know, I would happen upon things on the radio sometimes where I didn't quite understand what the music was, but I enjoyed how the music really made me feel, and that to me was more important than, you know, me having to, you know, listen to, say, for example, hip hop or whatever, which, you know, at that time was still relatively new in terms of the mainstream um, aspects of hip hop or whatever. You know, we're talking like the mid 1980s and later 1980s, where, you know, that was kind of the thing. You know, that's what made you hip or whatever as a young kid or whatever. Whereas in fact, I was
Right.
listening to what they call old people's music, you know, or I was listening to, you know, I was listening to white folks' music, or I was listening, you know, that's what people would call that. And to me, I didn't care what the name of it was. You know, I just liked it for how it made me feel, and also there was something to it, you know, that really resonated with me. So, you know, I not only wanted to explore sophistication of music from my generation, but I wanted to explore the history of all music, you know, like that extend from my tradition, you know, the black tradition. And it led me to become interested in music of other traditions, the Western European classical tradition, the Indian music tradition, a lot of stuff like that in the Asian music tradition. So it really got me interested in exploring all of these different forms of music and these different modes of expression. And it was just because I liked how the music made me feel. It wasn't for the reasons feeling like, okay, well, I'm intentionally listening to this other music to not fit into my social fabric. Like this wasn't a choice kind of a thing for me. Like this was something I just sort of did on my own without even thinking of labels or names or anything like that. Like I didn't care about that. So, and it's still the same now, you know, just in terms of what I do. It's a logical extension of my overall upbringing as a young person who, you know, I'm just a student of music, like I've always been, a student of music, period. Not a student of, you know, of hip hop, or not a student of jazz, or not a student of classical music, or not a student of new music, or I'm a student of music, period.
My eyes have been open certainly in the last few months. I mean, the killing of George Floyd and
Mhm.
sort of this uh, the surge in social justice. I mean, even further beyond what was going on before all of this. But we have institutions coming along saying Black Lives Matter and we support Black lives and this and that. And
Of course.
yeah, that's wonderful lip service. But what I mean, the proof is in the pudding.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
The proof is in the pudding. And what
Thank
I
you.
always find interesting, um, even going conservatory or whatever, people who are studying, who are majoring in classical performance or composition or whatever. Not everybody, but I'd say a good number of folks, when talking to
Sorry.
them
What
about,
what conservatory? Sorry about that.
I
What
went to
conservatory?
Juilliard. I went to Juilliard,
Juilliard. Okay. There you
um,
go.
and many of them just had this very simplistic view of what jazz was. Usually, it revolved around improvisation, which is there are a lot of forms of improvised music, um, and so not really understanding or caring to understand sort of the cultural foundations and elements of the music. That was something that was almost, I think, beneath um, many people who were just not in that world, and not to say
Uh,
that any of these folks would need to be a great a jazz musician in order for them to succeed in their careers. But I think the difficulty of playing jazz a lot of times is downplayed. And someone like Charlie Parker and the genius that he was, I
mhm.
mean, it's much more difficult, I'd say impossible, unless you're Charlie Parker, to play like Charlie Parker than to play a score of Shostakovich.
Mhm. Right.
and
Right.
and it's and
And
it's
and, and, and yet and yet and yet they tend to view that lens of improvisation as this almost this sort of other thing or whatever, right? Like other in the negative kind of in the negative sense of the word or whatever. They view it as this uh,
right.
sort of unnecessary otherness or whatever, or illegitimate otherness or something,
I mean, in my experience, I mean, it's run the gamut. I mean, many musicians that I run across and know, I mean, when it comes to Western classical music, jazz musicians, who
Mm,
are African American or otherwise, many of them are very much into the Western classical canon. Now, maybe that's not
yeah,
at the core of what their influences, but they definitely can at least appreciate it and admire it for what it is, and take something
yeah.
from it. I mean, I rarely find someone, I think, who says, "Oh,
It's like, why is that never discussed?
say what again?"
Then why is that never discussed?
Yeah, right.
Why isn't that discussed as often as the white classical musician or the white classical composer versus the black so-called other, like, sort of jazz composer? I mean, it's like, why isn't the um, why isn't it argued conversely that those jazz musicians are very influenced or whatever by classical music as well, and can perform Western classical music as well, and that sort of thing, but also give it something a little more interesting than just simply interpreting a piece of music, cut and dry on a piece of paper. Like, why isn't that discussed? As much as this other thing is.
I mean, I think, well, I think the notion of the other, I'll just use that term, playing this music that is part of such a um, sacred sacred entity, if you will. Like, the notion of someone who's not from that tradition or is not coming up from a certain thing. The fact that they're maybe performing a piece of Bartok or whomever, Brahms or
Mm,
Mozart. I feel like there's a certain kind of a sense of uh, possessiveness or uh, you know ownership of some kind of territory, and I think that goes across the board. I mean, and we see this in I'd imagine in all forms of art and music, where people have they're guarding their bones. They want to protect. It's almost like protecting some kind of religion.
mm,
Which I do feel that it's becoming, or maybe it's always been to some degree, a lot of this for people is a religion. So this is my canon, this is my doctrine or dogma, and we're going to stay in here, and then you can stay in there. It's like the AME versus the Episcopalians versus the Catholics versus the Lutherans, whatever. Everyone has their own
mm,
little
mm,
own little tribe, own little community that they stay in. And the idea of, I mean, even when I performed this program back in February at the Phillips, this is the first time I've ever really done this, because I read an interview with Keith Jarrett. Somebody asked him, "Would you ever play Western classical music with a program with Western classical music and improvised jazz music. And he said something to the effect like, I don't know if you know this interview. He was like, I'd never do that because you're using different parts of your brain, and the performance practice requires certain things. And he has a point. I think there's something to that.
Yeah.
But I was like, you know what? I'm actually going to play a program. It has nothing to do with uh, genre. It's just I just put a bunch of music together that I wanted to play and I like. So that included
Hmm.
some things from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Satie, Debussy, some stuff from Sweet Bergamasque, Thelonious Monk, Duke
Hmm.
Ellington, and then I think I ended with Timo Andres's "How Can I Live in Your World of Ideas."
Mm.
And you
Well, I
know,
wish
I
I saw that.
would you say?
Said I wish I would have seen that. That's really incredible.
I mean, it was stressful. I'm going to say that because I was kind of going back and
Sure.
forth between, how am I going to play this? And I mean, certainly most of it was memorized, and my memory is not like. I mean, it's okay, but it's not like super super strong. So I have to really be
Hmm.
dedicated to something to retain it. So when I did it, I was just like, let me see if I can actually get through it, and it was okay. People seem to enjoy it, which I think is a good barometer. I want people to enjoy the performance just as much as I enjoy playing for people. But the point of it more was to see if on a I'd say more basic level, just try uh, to break the genre boundaries and simply express myself in a way that's just natural for me to do it, and things that I like and I feel close to and I feel that I can communicate with. And um, it was, I have to say, it was very satisfying. But I'm sure in certain circles, um, on either side, maybe that wouldn't fly. Maybe certain critics or certain presenters would be like, no, I don't think our audience, this is not, what we, what our traditional model is.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, that was right before COVID, so I haven't done a
Right.
performance
Sure.
really since then. But I'm personally trying to look more along those lines as we hopefully move out of this, and I'm able to perform again, just not really having these barriers, which personally I have to say in all truthfulness that these are things that I've placed on myself because other people have sort of created them, maybe for me. So
Exactly. I mean, the boxes don't exist. I mean, we create those boxes. You know what I mean?
exactly
We find the person who is accountable for those boxes, and then we try to align ourselves with them or whatever. But those
right.
boxes, as far as I'm concerned, never have existed. In fact, I'm grateful to you for telling me, about the way that you put this program together. And fortunately, we're in a situation now where, there are a lot of performer composers who are working in the so-called jazz idiom, and even in the classical idiom, who are engaging in one another's fields or whatever. For instance, like 20 years ago or whatever, with Jason Moran integrating classical repertoire into his sets with the bandwagon,
Right.
that he did. How he would do, how he would sometimes perform the Brahms Opus 118 number two or whatever, along with a set of his own original compositions, along with something like, say, for example, like Planet Rock or something like that, or whatever. Have that all be a part of the set. Which I think was, at that time, I didn't really see many people doing that. But fortunately, there is a growing community of people, I think, who are willing to engage or whatever in these various mediums, and we're also seeing now some quote unquote classical, or you might say new music, people who are engaged in new music, they're also engaging more, with improvisation, not from a so-called jazz lens, but just
Right.
as a general principle,
Right.
like just because that's how I try to, I mean, I deal with improvisation in several different languages. Like I don't just deal with in the so-called jazz language. I mean, I deal with it as a general concern for me. It's something that I deal with, without any kind of cultural or social categorization. You know, improvisation to me is all encompassing, and it can be whatever the language of the composition is asking for.
I was talking to Cecile McLaurin Salvant one time. Well, actually, not
Oh
one,
yes.
many times. And have you met her?
Mhm.
Have you met her?
No, I hope to meet her someday. But
Uh,
she's an incredible performer. I mean, just
I mean,
mind blowing.
eh,
Absolutely.
yeah. I mean, I would love to hear a conversation between the two of you because I mean, I'm hearing a
Hmm.
lot of a lot of similarities in your sort of thinking and approaches to things. And she told me one time, um, she said. A lot of times classical music is seen as this sort of like sacrosanct art form. And what's important is that first of all, the music can still evolve, even if it's something that's written 200 years ago. It can still evolve
Hmm.
at all levels. It could evolve if someone who's an intermediate musician performing it. It could evolve if it's the greatest virtuoso playing today. But many times, and I think maybe recording might have done this, there's sort of a standard that is created for how something is interpreted. Another thing is none of this music, well, I should say none of this music, the music before
Hmm.
the 19th, before the 20th century wasn't, you can't hear it. You don't know what it sounds like. Nobody knows what it
Right.
really sounds like. So there are these ideas that have been placed um, based on treaties or things that such and such studied with such and such, and then he studied with such and such, and so that then this is like sort of like the gospel being um, passed down from one generation to another. But at the end of the day, like you know, this music can still have a long lifespan if we don't approach it with such approach it like it's a piece of like a doily or something that's so fine that
Yeah.
we can't really get it dirty. So I mean, now one of the things that I haven't seen live, I've seen your sextet live.
Yeah.
I've seen there was a great John Zorn concert I saw at National Sawdust with you and Vicky Chow, and
Oh. Yeah.
that
Right.
that was incredible. But the conduction, um, I have not seen, and I
Hmm.
just wanted you to talk for those of the listeners out there who aren't familiar with that. Uh, the idea of improvised conducting and certain kind of cues. I mean, I'll let you explain it because I'm
Sure.
not going to do it justice, but that's a
Sure.
very fascinating component to what you do.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's definitely a radical direction taken away from, not taken away, but it's sort of a radical transformation of what you know of this sort of Eurocentric way of thinking about music. A lot of great people who have been my forebearers and people who whose work I've actually came up under were people such as Butch Morris, who really sort of coined the term conduction. He was the person responsible for coining that term, and he started dealing with that stuff, in the '70s. I mean, you have people like Buho Richard Abrams and other people like that who were kind of investigating these different ideas of conducted improvisation since the '60s. I mean, I'm talking about as early as like 1961 with the experimental band in Chicago, a group of musicians who got together at I think it was called the CNC Lounge or whatever. It was in Chicago, and Muhal would sometimes conduct. I mean, he would tell some of the people to bring their music or whatever, but then he would also do these things where he would conduct certain people in the band and sort of tell, okay, well, you play here, and what I want you to do, I want you to, you know, do this specific, you know, improvisatory thing or whatever it is. So we have people doing that since the '60s in terms of conducted improvisation. I mean, Lucas Foss is another person, um, who's more in new music who has done this. So you had Lucas Foss, you had even Stockhausen, you had Boulez. I mean, you had all kinds of people like that who were sort of experimenting with these different methods of of navigating through formal music, but also improvisation to an extent. I tend to work with people who are not as familiar with the language,
Okay.
and so my language is called autoschediasms,
Yeah.
and so what that language is sort of a departure also in a way from the Morris and Braxton vocabulary. Yes, I do use some of Butch Morris's visual signals, but oftentimes different cases are applied to those signals, or additional cases may be added to some of those signals. So autoschediasms can work in three categories. The first one is, or not three categories, three sort of modes of music making, I'd say. So the first mode of music making is called gesture, which involves visual cues and things, mainly some of those that were employed by Butch, but that I've assigned different sorts of cases to work against those. So that's the first aspect of it. The second aspect of it is autonomy, where thinking of Anthony Braxton's language music systems, um, the performers can perform, are free to perform several numerical signals that I give, with one hand or whatever. Like if I give a performer a signal of number two, it would indicate to them to, perform whatever action I've assigned to it and everything. And they can do that on their own. Like they don't have to do it only on my downbeat. They only can do it until they can do it until I cut them off, but they can do it at whatever tempo or anything like that that they wish. The third aspect of autoschediasms, and probably the most complicated part of it, is called category. Now, category is it can be cues that are written on a whiteboard that can indicate certain types of ensemble behavior. It can be based on distance. It can be based on an extended technique. It can be based on something that another player has done. It can also be based on notation that I would write on that whiteboard. It could be based on a certain type of action that I'm going to want the players to do, but not just merely playing your instrument, but you have to do something that in some kind of response to what another player is doing, within any place in the ensemble.
I mean, that's I have to say, just as an aside. I mean, this is less to do
Yeah,
with music, but more to do with just the what I miss. During this period, not being able to travel and
right.
experience local restaurants and cuisines. I mean, it's just like that's. I mean, any town you go to, small town where you can find, just something that's just unique to that area, especially like in Europe. I mean, it's just something that I really miss because it can just be a simple meal that's like a family restaurant or something like that, and it's amazing.
Yeah, like as much as this period is a drag, in terms of us not being able to go out there and do this, it also leads us to dig deeper into ourselves and continue to ask ourselves, why we do this. Like how much integrity was really there before the pandemic.
Right,
What did you put in? How much of yourself did you really give to the music before this happened? You know what I mean? You start to think of stuff like that. And this pandemic, I guess, has sort of brought us to really ask these questions, to ourselves as artists. It's interesting. I was having a conversation with Michael Carvin a few days ago, and he told me something that was very profound. He said, "Well, look, I mean, you're a musician, right? So what did you do? How did you get to the level you got to be at? Being a musician, you're already in a quarantine towards greatness. So why are you going to stop now? What
I mean,
why are you going to curse? Why are you going to damn it now? 20 something years or 30 years later.
let me just one last question here, just about like,
Yeah,
do you feel like the external that you at times pay attention to external pressures about what's expected of you, because there's been a lot of wonderful like rave reviews, and you've been lauded from all corners of the musical establishment. But even with all of that, do you feel like I have to do something even better, even greater, to sort of prove myself and my worth as a musician, or is that something that you really don't give any kind of?
Nah, I'm done with that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm done with that. I spent too much of my life worrying about that to the point where, you know, I would discourage myself or frustrate myself, and not be happy with what I was doing as an artist. And so and that's, truth be told, that is one of the reasons why I've actually signed off of social media even, because that's that's something that comes up all the time. You know, like you almost have to feel like when you watch another person's level of success, you measure your success based on how you view the other person. Who you're watching on social media. Playing some killing solo or playing some like really amazing stuff on a piano or a drum set or whatever the case, whatever. It's at a certain point, it's like, listen, you're not them. Get over it. You know what I mean? You're not going to be, you know, you're not going to be the person whom you're like comparing yourself to. Like
Well, I think
that's
even
that's
beyond
that's
that.
that's that's inherent. But beyond that, um, the other thing is like even this idea of putting this kind of pressure on myself, to prove myself to whether it's the press or the media or whatever. It's like I don't care to do that because I mean it would be like me basically making the same record all the time. It would be like
Right.
me putting out the same kind of music all the time. It's just I'm not interested in succumbing to that pressure anymore. I was at one point, but see, when you're concerned about what everyone thinks of you, and when you're always like into that sort of thing, people are going to read it and use it against you. That's something I learned very early on, but I didn't. It took me many years later to kind of apply that, in terms of how I carry myself, and it's interesting you bring that up because you know, especially in light of the COVID situation. Everybody is, not everybody. I shouldn't, I'm overgeneralizing, but a lot of people out there um, are finding other ways to get music out there, and but the music that they get out there sometimes is not really to my taste or not really to my liking. But everyone's doing that, and that seems to be the popular thing. And so, what now? Do I have to follow that? Like, only because I function within this realm of music, do I have to be the next person to do the same thing everybody else is doing? Like I don't believe in that, and I used to put pressure on myself to be like, well, maybe I need to do this too, like what X is doing or what so and so is doing. Like I need to do exactly what they're doing to feel successful, to feel like I'm successful. It's like, no, you feel like you're successful by your own actions, by your own fingerprint. You have to say to yourself that you're special. It's not some kind of ego trip. I mean, it's like you're special, and that's plain and simple. You have your own fingerprint, just as the other person has their own fingerprint and their own way of doing things in their own kind of imagination. It's not coming from a place of ego. It's recognizing that you are an individual and that you don't need to put such pressure on yourself to be like somebody else. No matter what the press says or no matter what other artists around you are saying and everything. And it's very challenging to do that in times like this. But that's what this COVID-19 situation is doing. It's kind of testing us to really, see the greater value of recognizing your individuality.
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
I don't know.
Not too, I think that's you got the last word on that one. Tyshawn Sorey,
Oh man,
thank you, thank you so much. It was
Aaron,
really a pleasure. Thank
it's
you.
it was the pleasure was all mine, and I hope that we do this again, maybe informally. We'll set up a time or whatever. We'll do this again because I really enjoyed this. It was really really great.
Well,
Yeah.
you take care of yourself, and yeah, let's Let's chat again soon. Thank you.